See, so Charles, I'm going to bring you back in here because you've got some really astonishing reporting to do with the armed forces in UK and solar panels.
I have, and bearing in mind COP28 is in full swing, I've got a headline from the BBC website which almost requires a second read because it, at first glance, looks as though it might be some crafty asymmetric warfare strategy to do down the Chinese. Solar panels used by British Army linked to claims of forced labour in China. Now, a photograph accompanies this. If we click on one, just to verify that in actual fact the Army definitely does have solar panels, there are two soldiers walking with them, so it must be real. And this refers to Project Prometheus. Now, we'll go on and have a look at the detail of that. I couldn't help but think Prometheus was an interesting subject or an interesting title for the project. Prometheus, of course, being a titan, the god of fire, who is best remembered for having tricked men and gods by cooking up a great big ox, cutting it in half, and trying to disguise the bones as the best bit by covering them in fat, which, of course, is a trick that Zeus fell for. Allegorical, perhaps, with the net zero agenda and policy. But that's by the by. The project itself, which is described on the MOD website, is under the banner of how we are transforming for a sustainable future. So if we click on one, we can just see that they've got this site that we saw at Leconfield. It's the first of 4 pilot sites, and they list where the other ones will be. They then boast that when they've completed the 4 schemes, it will result in £1 million in efficiency saving and reduce emissions by 2,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So we'll keep those statistics in mind. The first, as a sort of frame of reference, years ago, well, some years ago, over a decade ago, when Chelsea Barracks was sold, the figure sticks in my mind at being somewhere over £900 million was the value of the sale. Within a year of selling that land, the Ministry of Defence had spent more than that money housing the people that had been taken out of accommodation in Chelsea Barracks. So that just gives an idea of how defence spending can work if not kept on top of. But again, with the sort of the climate agenda and the environmental piece in mind, I thought I'd have a look at the perceived cost of their core business, which involves blowing an awful lot of things up. So we look at the International Politics and Security Journal, if we can just put that on the screen now. And we've got an appropriately sort of blackened image, but it's suggesting that war is a climate killer. And indeed, if we go on to the next slide, we'll see that that's reinforced by the Conflict and Environment Observatory, the military's contribution to climate change. And if we click on one, they articulate that with a photograph. Again, enormous great explosion. So you get the idea. A lack of transparency makes it hard to calculate the true scale of military emissions. And they explain that in the next slide because they produce a report. Sorry, wrong, not the next one. But we'll have a quick look at this because we've got the... and I think, sorry, is there not a slide in between?
No, but there isn't. It
Perhaps
goes...
not. No, okay, no, that's fine. In which case, if we can go on to the Harvard review, and we also have to consider the nature of the munitions that they're using. And in this case, we've got a focus on depleted uranium, which of course was in the news as having been sent to Ukraine and being declared safe. And if we click on one here, we see that the text suggests that depleted uranium may pose a risk to both soldiers and local civilian populations. So we've got the human and environmental cost. When ammunition made from depleted uranium strikes a target, the uranium turns into dust that is inhaled by soldiers near the explosion site. The wind then carries the dust to surrounding areas, polluting local water and agriculture. So we've got the sort of dual harms of man and environment. Of course, there's not an awful lot more research on this because if you don't look, you don't find. And that seems to be the principle that governs the way in which this is put out. The next slide shows another organisation that's looked into this in quite a bit of detail, the Scientists for Global Responsibility, and specifically going back to what was said earlier about the emissions side of it. They say that that figures for direct GHG emissions are no longer included, we estimate that the figures that are reported in the main text of the report cover less than 1/3 of the MOD's total direct emissions. So if we click on to the next slide, we'll just have a little bit more detail from their report. And the next bit up on the screen gives text cleverly referring to the carbon boot print of the UK military. But they talk about the various ways in which emissions can be projected up into the atmosphere, which of course can be fires from burning buildings, fuel depots and vegetation, healthcare for civilian and military survivors, and post-conflict reconstruction. So there are a lot of things that relate to this, and they go on to cite further detail, which if we just put that on screen now, I talked about things that will blow up, and they specifically refer to an example from Syria and Iraq. So they say in 2017, the UK military launched over 1,000 bombs and missiles in Iraq and Syria. The typical size of such a weapon was 500 pounds in weight. In certain cases, the mass of the GHG emissions arising from the use of such a bomb could be many thousands of times the mass of the weapon. For example, a bomb this size could cause the concrete columns of a building to fall, to fail within a 20-meter radius of the explosion. So when we consider that they were boasting about the Leconfield site saving 2,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide per year, it is something of a drop in the ocean. And I think this gets to the sort of smoke and mirrors and hypocrisy, I would say almost complete pointlessness of the situation. So again, we have to consider the bill attached to this. And so I've got a House of Commons briefing paper, which I'd just like to put up now, the most recent document on defence expenditure, because I think this explains one or two things about it. The historical defence expenditure, so we can see that on the left in real terms, how much it's sort of gone up and down, and then on the right-hand side when set against GDP. And I would like to point out that sort of uptick just at the bottom right-hand side of the graph in the sort of 2019-20 bit, in effect going up now. And we'll go on to have a look at the next slide, because the reason that this is important is that this graph here shows the cost of, in effect, a busy armed force or armed forces. And the peak there shows the uplift of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you can see how abruptly that's fallen away. And in effect, there is massive underemployment now. So we think about the uptick in spending. How is that the case when operations have dropped off to quite such a degree? Because they are expensive. So if we just click on one, we'll see not necessarily exactly how that's the case, but more pertinently, why. So it's saying that the annual defence budget will be £5.8 billion higher in cash terms by the end of the current spending review period. And the critical bit here is that most of this additional funding has been allocated to capital budgets, i.e. money that is spent on major projects and investment, whereas the Ministry of Defence's day-to-day budget is set to decline in real terms over this period. And then, here we go, as a member of NATO, the UK is committed to spending 2% of GDP on defence each year. And then it boasts it was one of just 9 NATO member countries to have met this target in 2022, spending 2.1% of GDP on defence. Now, I'm not exactly sure how much those solar panels at Leconfield and elsewhere will have cost, but it is interesting to note that in order to get into NATO's good books, by deploying a load of solar panels, it is possible to inflate defence spending on not just that, obviously, but plenty of other capital projects, and to make it look like the defence budget is being spent in a way that perhaps it isn't.
Charles, thank you for that. Hypocrisy was the word you used, and that came to my mind that, of course, we can start wars worldwide using explosives, setting oil refineries on fire, destroying buildings, billions of pounds of destruction with the expenditure and we'll say damage to the environment on reconstruction, but nobody in UK or NATO, the US, EU is calling for the wars to stop in order to save the planet. We want the violence to continue while we preach saving the planet. The hypocrisy is truly mind-blowing.